Good afternoon, everyone. We are here and we have met today for the launch of Museum of Innocence on Google Cultural Institute. I'm here in Istanbul with Mr. Orhan Pamuk, the founder of the museum, and Mrs. Lucia Pini, the creator of Museo Bagatti Valsecchi, and the director of Google Cultural Institute, Amit Sood. Also, he is in London. Welcome our meeting. And I would like to ask Mr. Pamuk about his inspiration first. When you visited the Bagatti Museum, on what stage was yours, the Museum of Innocence? It was just an idea or the process working?
I already had the idea of the project, that is, that Museum of Innocence, both as a novel and as a museum. The idea was to write a novel that will more or less serve as a catalog of a museum. In the museum, I was planning to exhibit daily life objects of people of Istanbul used between 1950 and end of the century. If you come to Museum of Innocence, you would see kitchen utensils, salt shakers, landscape, postcards, all the government papers you need to survive in Istanbul, movie tickets, scenes from Turkish movies of 50s, 60s, 70s, visions of Istanbul, all the bibelots that people of Istanbul bought, gift objects, lamps, shadows, also things that are not easy to represent in a museum, all the foods, sometimes dreams, metaphors, along with the things that the people use in daily life. If you visit Museum of Istanbul, you would have more or less the texture, visual qualities of life in Istanbul between 1950 and to end of 20th century. The concept was to combine this imagery with a novel. When I visited Bagatti Valsecchi Museum, I already had the concept and I was looking for inspiration. My idea was my character, Kemal, who combines all these objects in a story with my help and exhibits them in a museum because he is terribly in love with his twice removed cousin. Museum of Innocence, the novel, tells the story of a Istanbul upper-class secular boy who is infatuated by his love for his twice removed cousin, who is from perhaps a poorer branch of the family. The idea of the museum and the novel was to perhaps represent the texture of life in Istanbul and tell a story of obsessive love where the main hero collects everything his beloved touches. This has also Sufi implications in the sense that after he is in love, my character spirit changes completely and he sees the world through objects, through his love.
What kind of inspiration were you looking for just the setup or something else?
I was looking for museums where the museum designer, maker spends last years of his life, last decades of his life in the museum. That is, people who convert their houses, the places where they live, into a museum. Bagatti Valsecchi Museum is designed, made by two aristocratic Italian gentlemen who had an eye for evoking the Renaissance period Italian houses. So they went out from their regular civil homes to collect collected things and did both artificial, just like my character, artificial house they lived in. When they died, the museum continued to live its natural life. Kemal's story, the hero of Museum of Innocence, visits, along with Bagatti Valsecchi, many European and in fact world museums with an eye on museology to represent his life. More or less, the logic of Museum of Innocence is very similar to logic of the novels, that we want to talk about our lives, we want to represent our lives. When you come to Museum of Innocence, you see objects which with some aura, with some atmosphere, in an atmosphere, because the meaning, the meaning of objects are explained in the novel, but you can enjoy the museum without reading the novel itself.
Okay, on that point, let's turn to Milan and Mrs. Pini. Could you also share the story of Bagatti Museum with us?
Yes, as Mr. Pamuk told, at the beginning, Bagatti Valsecchi Museum was not a museum. It was just a house, and it was created by two brothers, Fausto and Giuseppe Bagatti Valsecchi, at the end of the 19th century. They were noble, and they decided to restyle their family mansion and in a neo-Renaissance style. And in the same time, they start collecting works of art from the Renaissance. But what was very important for them was that very strong connection between the house and the collection. So everything was carefully planned so that you can feel no gap between the domestic interiors and the objects that are kept inside the house. And the consequence of this fact is that when you get to the museum, you have a sort of full immersion experience, and in a way, a sort of space and time displacement.
And I would like to also talk about how the museums influence people, especially the people on creative industry. What do you think about that?
I care about memories. That for me, a novelist, that there is not an absolute present, that every moment has a slippery nature, that we live present combined with an intermixture of past. There is no, since there is no absolute present, today, as we move around in our daily lives, as we live in cities, the past is reminded to us by whatever we see in the cities. That's in fact why we care about preserving our cities, monuments, squares, old buildings, because each of these things remind us our memories. I care about this because there is a strong demand in us to attach to our memories. We are let's say we are terribly angry, or we are in love, and we are in some certain place in our cities. Next time we are in that square, next time we see that building, next time we see that view of Bosphorus from that certain hill, uphill, then we are reminded, just because we see the same thing, of our memories. But once that building, once that statue, once that park is demolished, we perhaps lose our connection to our memories. In that sense, buildings, squares, trees, fountains, whatever we see in our cities, whatever I care about describing in my books, push us back to our memories. In that sense, everything we see in our daily lives, in the cities, are an index. A city is an index to our memories. Once the city is destroyed, we also lose our memories. Objects also have the same power to evoke the past. That is why, as we get older, we get attached to the objects of our daily lives. I argue that there should be more small museums honoring our daily life objects. So museums should focus on personal stories rather than stories of communities, nations, companies, big communities, because museums, I argue, as I did in Museum of Innocence, should explore, dramatize, find the meaning of the objects in our daily lives.
So, Mrs. Pini, your museum has a longer history than the Museum of Innocence. What is your observation about the influence of the museums over people?
What I can say that is that I think I agree with Mr. Pamuk. We need museums because we need to preserve memories. We immediately perceive how many things this object is carrying inside, and it's a sort of a personal heritage. And we can perceive the complex stratifications of life that this object is able to express. It can tell us something about the collectors. It can tell us something about their ambition. It can tell us something about the unknown Renaissance man who use it in its everyday life and about its habits. I should say that the object is a sort of a fragment of lives and words. And that is the reason why museums are so important, because they keep us in touch with our memory.
Okay, life is also changing. We are now collecting some memories and sharing our memories online. And how did you decide to take the museum to the online platform? What kind of sharing or
We were very
accompanying the
happy
experience?
when Google approached it. Also, one of the challenges of making this museum was my character, with my help, my fictive character that I helped, collected this whole immense collection of things from cigarette butts, cigarettes, matches, spoons, everything, clothes, shoes, everything people uses. Now, we had this vast collection, and all the objects that we had um, were also described in the Museum of Innocence, the novel. Perhaps that's what makes the novel a bit long, but it's a novel of obsession, and my character, Kemal, who is deeply infatuated by love, pays a loving attention to description of these objects, which echoes the language of museum catalogs. When the visitors come to the museum, they will have first, they will smile. They will have an uncanny experience because, in the end, the objects in our museum are objects of a fictional story. Though they know that this is a novel, this is a fictional story invented by some writer, Orhan Pamuk, they will have an ambiguous experience. Well, this was a fictional story. Now they see the real objects. While on the other hand, one aspect of Museum of Innocence, that it's a modest city museum, a museum of innocence. Even if you haven't read the novel, you will enjoy Museum of Innocence as a city museum that shows, exhibits, dramatizes objects of people of Istanbul used between 1950s and end of 20th century. The challenge was to put these objects in vitrines, boxes, in such a way that they also look beautiful, please the eye, that the whole atmosphere of the Museum of Innocence and making the vitrines look uncanny, convey a certain sense of history, lend an aura of past that will give us, that will keep our memories in a slippery, ambiguous, strange way alive. So, in that sense, we are happy. Just like any work of art, our framed objects, our boxes, vitrines, and we gave a lot of time to it. That's why finishing the Museum of Innocence, I thought I would do that. Just we had the objects, put them in some vitrines, and you will have the museum. But then making these vitrines, composing them, putting them in boxes, in such a way that the visitor will feel the uncanny atmosphere of forgetting, remembering, repressing, remembering, trying to forget. All the things we do when we fall in love perhaps are represented in the visitor's experience of the museum. So in a way, we were happy that not only Museum of Innocence, like old-fashioned museums, represents the life of Istanbul, but that these objects are displayed, are composed in such a way that they hope to be found beautiful objects of art, or objects that you would want to look at again. So in that sense, we are very happy to be part of Google project that even though this museum can be also a city museum, an anthropological museum, but it also wants to be an art museum. And the beautiful thing about that, you just look at it without any sense of what it's all about. We argue that the boxes in Museum of Innocence please the eye beyond time, transgressing time, context, history. And in fact, the best thing about museums is that I argued in the novel, and perhaps the poetics of Museum of Innocence as a museum is described, underlined in the novel itself, that museums are places where past time is converted into space, a space where the visitor can perhaps enjoy looking at things. In the end, Museum of Innocence is saying to the visitor, please look at these vitrines. These are made from daily life objects, but it will also please your eye, and the atmosphere will evoke Istanbul of 1950s and 60s.
Now, so the online visiting gives you some interesting experience of visiting a museum. You stay at home, maybe you drink your coffee, you are sitting on a table, and you are visiting a museum all over the world. What kind of experience it is, and how does it change the perception of the visitor, do you think?
Well, in 50s, 60s, in my childhood, when I wanted to be an artist, a painter in future, it was so hard to come across art books, reproduction books in Turkey. My uncle used to run a magazine, and in the middle page, he used to have a 2-page spread of a Renoir. That's how you would get access to Renoir in Turkey in 60s. Now, Google makes every beautiful object accessible. You can go to internet, get connected to these objects. After enjoying the object visually, looking at it, experiencing its confusing, beguiling, mysterious beauty, then you can go to Google more and check the background. But I think that interesting or strong thing about Google Art Project, it makes you bum, even before buying a ticket, before going to museum, before going to you just click, and here is that beautiful object in front of you. A beautiful thing by itself.
It's quite interesting. Also, I'd like to ask Mrs. Pini, how does the online visiting affect the perception of the visitors of the museum?
Oh, I think that's great, and it's particularly important for Bagatti Valsecchi Museum because, as I told you before, this museum is based on an experience that is a full immersion experience. So the virtual visit gives you the possibility of tasting this experience. You do not perceive just a sequence of images, but you can perceive rooms, you can perceive atmospheres, you can perceive domestic interiors. And this is very important for a house museum like Bagatti Valsecchi Museum is.
So I also wonder the views of Google Cultural Institute, of course. Mr. Amit Sood, what is your impression about the online visiting of both of the museums?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for, having me. And I'm a big personal fan of Mr. Pamuk for a long, long time. So this is like a little kid in a candy shop getting access to Mr. Pamuk. I hope we meet in person. I, I have read this book, obviously, and when, we started discussing the idea, I remember we had a phone call a long time ago, and, I was talking to Mr. Pamuk about it. I mean, for me, it's a pretty special day because of two reasons. One is because, we not only managed to realize virtually the vision that Mr. Pamuk had with the Museum of Innocence, but we also managed at the same time to have the museum that inspired him, Museo Bagatti, also on the platform. And I think that is where the power of the internet really comes into play, which is that you are capable to make these connections and break down barriers of geography, break down barriers of travel, of costs. And obviously, Lucia, I don't know if you know, but I'm a big fan of some of the pieces in your museum. There is a beautiful purse that actually I have shown my mother a couple of times that is in your collection. And my mother is based in India, and she is amazed, and now she wants to come to visit your museum because she wants to see this purse. So it's a really different experience when you take museums and cultural artifacts and present them in a magical way to people online. And I think that is really where Cultural Institute comes in, is because we are not really interested in presenting items in any ordinary way. We really want to present them in a magical way. So we want people to be able to zoom into the paintings. We want people to listen to the videos. We want people to have exhibitions. There's a beautiful exhibition that Mr. Pamuk has created online about the Museum of Innocence, which I have shown at least 20 friends over the weekend because they all are big fans of the book. So it's a real simple way for young audiences, global audiences, to take something that is very specific to a location and make it their own. For me specifically, the uh, the amazing story about Fazoon's cigarettes, and that he is collecting every cigarette butt that she smoked. I mean, when I read this, I said, this is amazing, but I had no idea that there was an artifact in the museum that shows every single cigarette butt. And we have gone and digitized it. So whole day, I think I have zoomed into the different cigarette butts for the different day. And I think already I spent 1 hour just playing with that one artifact. So, I will keep talking because I'm like a fan. But for me, the Google Cultural Institute, that is the mission, to make this content magical, to allow everybody to have access, and to let institutions like Museo Bagatti, Museum of Innocence, to tell their stories to a new audience.
Who is the new audience?
Well, the new audience could be my mother, who doesn't like going to museums. It could be my nephew and my niece, who think that museums are boring and they just want to be online on their computer, on their phone all the time. So the new audience for me is really an amazing question, because uh, as we move forward, we have people are interacting with art and culture in very different ways. People are on YouTube, on Instagram, on Pinterest, on Facebook. That's where they are spending a lot of their time. And it is really important that we make sure that we are allowing museums to tell those stories on these platforms, which is why, that's how you get to this new audience that could be younger, could be older, or could be just people who maybe want to come to museums only when they are tourists, right? So most of the time you go to a museum is when you're on holiday. But I think going to a museum every week online just to get a taste. Let's say I came to Istanbul and I visited the Museum of Innocence, and I want to, after 6 months, I want to feel again a little bit of that same memory. I can go online and I can feel that. So it's not a one-time experience. So I just think art and culture is something that everyone can enjoy if they have easy access, and access in a very magical way.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We had a great talk, and thank you for your attendance, and thank you for your sharing your ideas. I'm looking forward to see the Museum of Innocence online, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So much.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you so much.
So start from Milan, and when and how did you discover the Bagatti Valsecchi? Because the museum is wonderful, but it is not so known here in Italy too. And so I would like to know how did you arrive to the Bagatti Valsecchi?
Most probably in early 2000s, I don't remember the year, I was in Italy promoting one of my novels, and I was in Milano, and with a guidebook walking around from museum to museum. Not only I was going to places where they exhibit Leonardo, but I was going to other strange small museums, because I was going to do a small museum. I already had the subject. I already knew that I wanted to write more or less that functions as both a museum catalog and a novel. So I already knew my paradigma, my galaxy of problems were about objects that were placed in a house where the maker, the founder of the museum lived, and objects that were purposefully combined together to evoke a past that is past. And when I saw Bagatti Valsecchi Museum, someone realizes immediately that someone had already done what the character of Museum of Innocence, the novel, did. There is also the John Soane's Museum in London, or in Rome, there is Mario Praz Museum, and other small museums established, implemented, based on collections made by these people who had a vision of museums, who had an idea, and who are committed to small museums, and who see museums as a sort of an expression of their lives, their memories. Museums, as we know, most of the time, especially big museums, are there to represent a nation, a community, an organization, a company, while this kind of small museums are out there to represent, just like novels, individuality of a creative person, life story, interesting life story of a slightly different, marginalized person whose life experience is as interesting as a good novel. So the starting point here is that we see the individuality of the collectors rather than history of a nation or history of a community.
Thank you. The second question is, what do you mean with the word innocence? Why the name of your museum is Museum of Innocence? Because I think that innocence, I connect innocence with the word neutral, but I think that there is no collection really neutral, because every collection is the choice of one person.
English Webster's dictionary defines innocence. One of the connotations of innocence in Webster is artlessness, that which doesn't have pretensions of being artistic. My characters in the novel, in the Museum of Innocence, watch TV all the time, look at soap operas, and they are very naive. The drama of the novel is about innocence of women, a problem, perhaps in Mediterranean and my part of the world, still a problem, the problem of sex before and outside of marriage. And this is another innocence. Artlessness is another related to. But the whole project of Innocence of Museum as a novel, Innocence of Museum as a museum, Innocence of Objects, which is the catalog of the museum that connects it with the novel. And I will continue to produce perhaps other books and other projects and things that are related to innocence. The whole project is about objects and what we lend to objects. We go to a museum, we see 15 objects. Perhaps someone went to New Zealand and had passed some time with the locals there. Then he comes back and exhibits these objects, and perhaps that is what my character, Kemal, is doing in Museum of Innocence. He has deeply fallen in love. Unfortunately, his love story ends in a tragedy. Then he exhibits the objects that is left from that story, perhaps his whole life. Then tells us a story. Look at these objects and listen to me, says Kemal. But actually, all museums, small or big, says the same thing. Look at my objects and listen to my story. While these stories are not necessarily innocent. In fact, strong national museums, museums of big companies, nations, strong and politically correct repressive states use their museums to legitimize their horrors. While, and that makes me argue that objects by themselves are innocent. The guilt is the story that connects them. Museum of Innocence, in that sense, addresses to essentials. We are alone with the objects. And in a tongue-in-cheek, ironical way, I say, this time, the story is not the national epic of the nation. This time, the story is not the epic of the kings, but a sweet and sad love story of a person who is deeply infatuated, and I take it as seriously as the national history, national story.
Thank you. The last thing is the relationship between the two museums. The Bagatti Valsecchi is the collection of two brothers who collect a Renaissance object to evoke, to live again a glorious age, a glorious period of our history. So it is something that touch everybody. In Italy, it's very
It also
strong.
touched me, really. Yes.
Yeah. In the Museo of Innocence, instead, you choose the object of common people. I understand. It's right, no?
Yes.
So
there's a difference, of course. In Museum of Innocence, yes. Mm-hmm.
Just the relationship. What the meaning of your collection? What do you want to speak about? Speak about Istanbul, the city, a period. You think that this period could be a glorious period too?
In my Museum of Innocence, the idea of putting something like the idea of putting Renaissance on a pedestal, reminding Italians that our Renaissance was such a glorious time, and I am evoking it, or we are, two brothers are evoking it with all the objects we collect. And in fact, when they were collecting in late 19th century, most of the Italians did not pay attention to these doors, Renaissance objects. They were pioneers in the sense that they remembered Renaissance before the Italians or before the collectors. Museum of Innocence does have that idea of glorification in a modest way. In the end, modestly, I would say that this is the first city museum of Istanbul, focused on the second half of 20th century. If I am glorifying anything, I am glorifying the daily life of westernized, middle-class people of Istanbul, the objects they used in their kitchens, in their drawing rooms, the things that they use when they eat, when they sleep, when they fight, when they go to movies, their texture of the things they use. Yes, you're taking it granted that museums glorify a period. And what I respect in the founders of Bagatti Valsecchi museums is that they lived with the objects they collected. They did not go to curators to put on a pedestal their collections. They made the museum as they lived in it, just like my character, Kemal. In the end, the idea of museum was also closely connected to the idea of how to live, where to put objects, how important are the objects in our lives. And then there is a strong sense of individuality, personal taste, and determination to combine these sentiments with history. While my Kemal, who is more modest, is doing this museum so that everyone who is smiling at him because of his love story, which is sad, he wants to convert this sadness, this defeat, into a success, into a glory. At the end of the novel, my character, Kemal, perhaps echoing my sentiments too, is saying that we are all ashamed of our lives, which is on the margins of Europe. And 50s, 60s, very poor, not as rich as the Europeans, but he still wants to exhibit his failure through objects so as to give a sense of the life we lead in Istanbul, with a texture of visual qualities of our lives in Istanbul between 1950 and the end of 20th century.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pamuk.
Thank you so much.
For me, it's enough. We wait for you in Milan.
Yes, I'll come with the publication of my next novel by Einaudi. I understand it will be November.
November, okay. So November this year, yes.
Of course, we will be delighted if you could present it at the museum. You know that
yes,
you can when
yes,
you want.
Yes, thank you so much. Last time I was in Italy, in Milano. The presentation of the novel, Museum of Innocence, was made in the Bagatti Valsecchi Museum, and
yes,
that was such a memorable thing.
Yes. We wait for you for when you want. We are there.
Thank you so much, and we're hoping to see you and the black ladies in Istanbul.
Okay, all the black ladies. Don't worry, we'll be there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.